for inviting me here today. I am excited to share some of the work that I've just done over the years and to follow the presenter from yesterday who was talking about translanguaging, because my work is very much centered on what translanguaging is and how we can incorporate this into our classrooms and what it means for us as educators. So I'm going to start very briefly with a question, an opening question here. Should multilingual learners leave their other languages at the classroom door? And perhaps from you watching the presentation yesterday, the answer might be no. But I'd like you to think about how you were trained as a language teacher. And if you were taught to teach only in English, like I was, and whether you were discouraged from using other languages or for allowing students to use other languages in the classroom, and whether you were kind of unsure about the role of what students' L1 home language was in an English space. These are incredibly common experiences, and most of us inherited these beliefs during our own teacher education. I'd like to examine where these ideas come from because they didn't emerge by accident. The belief that English only, that additional languages are best learned through the exclusion of the target language has long shaped our field, educational theory, policy, and practice. And it's known as the monolingual myth. You might have heard this before. And this positions multilingual learners as obstacles or as deficits, rather than viewing their skills and resources and languages as something positive. So this kind of, we limit their participation really and their ability to meaning make and to affirm their identity. And we limit access to equitable learning opportunities when we promote this monolingual myth, perhaps unconsciously. So I have a comic here, and on the top you can see that this boy is introducing himself. He's saying, "Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Yul. I'm speaking English." On the right, you see him introducing himself in Korean. 안녕하세요. 저는 권율입니다. 반갑습니다. So he's saying, "My name is, nice to meet you." And then on the second line, we see a mix of languages. So he's using English and Korean. So he's saying cheese and 엄마, apple, 딸기. Okay, so we're seeing him mix languages. And then on the far right-hand side, he's saying 싫어, 싫어, no, no, no. So the top line represents this idea of how we, for a long, long time in our field, have thought about the separation of language and how languages are learned through as if they're separate entities that we can access. But really, if you just go out into the streets of India, as you know, that you hear multiple languages being used all the time. I live in Montreal in Canada, so French is the official language in my province. And so I hear French and English and Arabic and Farsi and Spanish and multiple languages. And people aren't just speaking in one language or one code. So here's the myth that we're talking about. So in this talk today, I want to kind of interrogate the origins of this monolingual myth by tracing some of the historical and theoretical roots. And I want to examine how this kind of became institutionalized in our second, in our foreign, in our additional language education spaces. And then I want to critique it by looking at some of the more contemporary language ideologies. So I want to draw on scholarship known as translanguaging and plurilingualism in order to argue for ideological and pedagogical shifts that recognize learners' full linguistic and cultural resources as valuable resources, while also acknowledging that this is a hot topic. There's a lot of complexities and considerations involved in the implementation of these kinds of pedagogies. Okay, so I'm going to move to my next slide. So the monolingual myth is the belief that languages are learned best through the exclusive use of the target language only. So this relies on the assumption that more English equals more learning, and that other languages interfere, and that successful language classrooms should be in English only. Um, the interesting question isn't whether this belief exists, but it's really why has this belief become so dominant? And one of the interesting things about the language teaching history is in the field, we actually began more with a monolingual perspective. In the grammar translation, this relied heavily on learners' first languages, not because teachers believed translation was the goal, but because it was considered the most effective way to access texts. And during the late 19th century, educators then began rejecting translation in favor of more what they called natural methods. So, the direct method that students should learn the target language in the same way that children acquire their first language, for example, through immersion. And then later we had the autolingual method, and that strengthened this separation between languages. And it drew on this behavioralist philosophy and psychology, where the first language was viewed primarily as a source of interference. So we've moved along in the field. Communicative language teaching methods are quite prominent. And although communicative language teaching never explicitly prohibited students' first languages, many teachers interpret that this is what it means. They say that meaningful communication means maximal use of the target language. And over time, these ideas have become institutionalized in our curriculum, in our assessments, in our policies, in the way we think. They influence how we teach, what we do in our classroom spaces. So what began as a pedagogical preference gradually really shifted into something that kind of became more commonplace. It didn't happen overnight. It was the product of more than a century of pedagogical thinking. So that's why these monolingual beliefs are so strong and still so prevalent in our field. Why does it persist? Because of teachers' beliefs. You know, we were mostly trained perhaps with believing that monolingualism was the way to go. And we see this reflected in policies, in our language policies or nation state policies, for example, and then also in assessment in high stakes testing, etc. But multilingualism research has fundamentally changed how we understand language learning. So I've created this image here just to visually depict kind of the difference between some of these traditionalist ideologies of this kind of monolingual approach to language. This views language as like separate language systems within the learner's mind. So seeing language as existing as separate. And on the right-hand side here, a translanguaging view or a plurilingual view understands that learners have one linguistic or semiotic repertoire in which they're pulling from multiple different features. They're making sense across languages, across modes of meaning, across body language, etc. So it's challenging our idea that language is separate and discrete, and getting us to rethink theoretically the interconnection of language. That languages aren't individual systematic features, but things that learners possess and that they have access to, and that they can use these to show their expertise in something, for example. So instead of viewing language as separate, multilingual speakers are drawing from this integrated repertoire. And so research shows us that this helps with comprehension, vocabulary, with reasoning, with collaboration, and also with their own identity. But this doesn't mean that, and I'm sure you learned this yesterday, that just anything goes, meaning that you can use all languages whenever you want in a classroom. Learning has to be strategic and strategically designed. So a little bit, here's another image about translanguaging and plurilingualism. So translanguaging describes how our multilingual speakers naturally draw on their linguistic and cultural resources to make meaning. Thus, a pedagogy of translanguaging means that us as teachers, we need to intentionally design opportunities for students to be able to do this. And plurilingualism is a theory that reminds us that perfect mastery of separate languages isn't what's important. It's the flexibility of using different linguistic resources depending on context. Even if you're using English speaking to a professor versus at a library, there's different ways that you would use English to communicate relationality, for example. Okay, so what are the benefits? What does the research say are the benefits of these approaches, translanguaging and plurilingualism? So recent research says that we have increased development of vocabulary. Students have increased scores on their assessment. Here's what's really important, and something I noticed in my research is that students have a heightened level of metalinguistic awareness and then cross-linguistic comparison. So they're talking about language together in the classroom. I see this increase and raise students' self-esteem and activate their prior knowledge. It repositions students in the classroom as experts, as the title of my talk is centering learners' cultural and linguistic expertise. This facilitates cross-cultural understanding and it builds homeschool connections because often this means that we have to involve the families or the parents to get involved in learning about or incorporating family language practices in the classroom. It fosters connections and relationships and it promotes student engagement and it increases creativity by reducing the fear of ambiguity. So we already have a rich body of work in the last 2 decades of why we should be engaging in a pedagogy or a way of thinking about language that values students' multilingualism. And so a little bit about translanguaging pedagogy. This is Ophelia Garcia here. I've had the chance to meet her several times, and she's one of the grandmothers of translanguaging. She's an incredibly sweet and humble woman, but she has core principles of what it means to engage in this kind of work. First, you have to believe in the value of your learners' practices. You have to understand that they're valuable and that teachers should use them in classrooms. How do we use them? We can't just have a free-for-all because we know that students may get carried away if they just speak their home language in classroom. So this requires us as teachers to design strategically in order to allow students to exercise their agency to use their linguistic resources. So I'm going to show you what that means and some things I've done in my classroom. But of course, there is resistance, especially to a newer kind of way of thinking about language, which I think has been really around for a long time. But there are challenges. One of the challenges is the uptake of translanguaging because of how languages are organized socially, economically, historically, politically. We know that languages are tied to nation states and that are typically considered these unchangeable structures. So we have explicit and implicit language policies that kind of reinforce the value and the permanence of language in a given context. So one example of policy is tied to named languages in the point system for immigration to Canada, for example. The higher you score on an English or French exam, the more points you acquire, the easier it is to immigrate to Canada. So we can't ignore these social conditions of language. So international students whose L1 is neither English nor French, they need to pass standardized language exams I'm sure you've heard of the IELTS exam in order to take for admission into university classes abroad. So these are obstacles that kind of challenge this idea of translanguaging. Some other factors is that teachers have misunderstandings about what translanguaging pedagogy actually really is. They assume that learners need to be fluent in English in order to access language from their L1, or they assume that learners need to be fluent in all the languages that are being used in the classroom, and that's not true. Teachers often say, well, I don't know the languages my students speak, so I can't possibly do this. And that's also not true. That's a misunderstanding around translanguaging. It is possible to set up learning environments without knowing the languages your students speak, and that's where you position them as experts. And there's this idea that students in the classroom all need to be able to speak the same languages. Like, what happens if we have one Arabic speaker and one Japanese speaker, for example? How do we create conditions for them? So these are all, I would say, like challenges or considerations of implementing translanguaging pedagogies. We know that language is socially situated and contextually dependent. So we also have to think about if we look at language minority rights, or if we look at indigenous languages that are being erased. So in these circumstances, maybe it's especially important to allow learners to draw on their indigenous languages and to center these in our classrooms. Okay, so instead of talking about theory, I'm going to show you what I mean with this little pedagogy. Okay, so let's experience multilingual meaning making ourselves together. So I want you to look at this book. The book is called Little Red Riding Hood. You may have heard this book title before. And I would like you to try to identify the language that's in this book. So, what is the language in picture number one? And in number two? How about number three? Number four? Number five? And then finally, number six. Okay, so how did you identify the languages? So none of the languages are in English. So how did you identify the languages? Okay, let me first tell you what they are. So the first one is French. So if you guess French, then that's correct. The second one, maybe you guess Mandarin, that would be correct. The third one is Portuguese. The fourth one is Spanish. The fifth one is German. And the last one is Arabic. So just I want you to think about how did you identify or how did you guess what the language would be, perhaps even if you don't speak Mandarin or even if you don't know German, for example. So we rely on our scripts, we rely on our images, our visuals, we rely on cognates, we rely on our prior knowledge and context and also visual cues. So these are all things that are helping us try to decipher this. Okay, so here's another task. So now that you know a few of the titles, you're going to match the words in each of the titles so that you connect the meaning so that it's the same. So, for example, le, what does le mean in the bottom? What does petite mean? Does it mean little? Does it mean red? Does it mean riding? Does it mean hood? Okay, so you can use, I'll just give you a minute to look at question one, two, and three. Okay, I'm going to show you the answers now. And again, if you don't speak these languages, if you don't speak Spanish, if you don't speak French, then how is it that you're able to be able to answer these? And that's a great question that I like to talk to when I'm in my classroom teaching teachers. So when I'm doing teacher education, this allows me to talk with teachers about their perceptions of language. I often ask them to reflect upon which ones they thought was easy to guess, which ones they thought were more difficult. And this reveals the visibility of certain languages, how languages have particular status in Canadian schools, for example. It also surfaced conversations about how like English, French, and European languages were often perceived as more accessible or more legitimate, while other languages like Arabic or Mandarin were positioned as less familiar. So we discuss this in class. We talk about what makes these languages difficult and why, and what positions these languages as having more prestige. And so we talk about language and we talk about power when we have these conversations in our classrooms. Okay, but I'm going to point to some of the perhaps strategies that you drew on, not knowing what these languages were. So perhaps you identified languages based on their script, their spelling, or other visual cues. So the task in the first task, you may have identified the Arabic and Chinese book covers because they were different scripts being used than the written phonetics of of the English alphabet. Number B, you may have recognized words or phrases across the different books that looked familiar or had a similar or same origin or meaning. So red as rouge, or in French, or rosa in Spanish. So you might have drawn on your background knowledge in English to make sense of words in other languages. You could have also inferred the meaning of words in other languages based on context clues, or maybe you recognize parts of the speech that were similar across the languages. So, for example, la in French to la in Spanish. Or maybe you used the sound or pattern recognition to infer the meaning of unfamiliar words in another language. Okay, so there's all these strategies that students use when you allow them to make these connections across languages. What if I told you to do the same task, but that you couldn't think in another language, or you couldn't access your previous knowledge or resources that you had in another language, and you had to do them solely in the language you saw, or solely just based in English? That's when things become a bit difficult, right? So allowing our students to draw on their expertise and their prior knowledge is really helping them and helping us as teachers in the classroom. Okay, here's an example of an activity that I used during my PhD. So I completed my PhD at the University of Toronto in 2023. And at that time, I was teaching ESL in a university, and these students were academic students. So they were learning English for academic purposes, and they were in their last English class before they went into their undergraduate or graduate program. And so I thought, why don't we try doing multilingual in our classroom? But the challenge I had was that we weren't in face to face. This happened during the pandemic. So one of the tasks I asked was to just put these emojis on the left-hand side here, and then we talked about them together as a class in English. Like, what might this image mean in English? So we generated these English words together: happy, joyful, excited, content. And then we had the list of the named languages that students spoke in that classroom. So you may recognize some of these languages here. And actually, I forgot to add one of the languages that the students spoke. And one of the students was like, hey, where's my language? Where's Arabic? Put Arabic up there. So this simple task became a really meaningful activity because students then got to show their language, and they felt a great sense of pride and excitement to be able to talk and share their language and show their language with other students in the classroom. This brought up a conversation of scripts versus phonetic alphabet. We talked about text direction. We talked about pronunciation. So this one simple task became a really engaging and fruitful conversation, and allowed students to talk about their meta language around language. So that's just an example of something that you can do in your classroom. Okay, so Jim Cummins and Margaret Early here say that when we create these kinds of activities, what we're doing is we're holding up a mirror to the students in which their identities are reflected back in a positive way. We're saying that you matter, your languages matter. We're, as teachers, going to make space for them, and we're going to let it to be a resource in the classroom, not something we have to ban in our classroom. Okay, and so some of the research has also said that when we create these kinds of safe classroom environments, then we're not generating this kind of anxiety around performing in English, right? So it becomes a space in which people can make mistakes because other students are trying to speak Mandarin, and so they're learning about pronunciation. And so this reduces the anxiety of English performing perfectly in English in the classroom space, because the teacher then also is no longer the expert in just English. They're the learner of all the languages their students are using as well. Okay, and Meryl Swain and Sharon Lapkin, these are Canadian scholars, by the way. They say that to insist that no use be made of the L1 in carrying out tasks in both linguistically and cognitively complex is to deny the use of an important cognitive tool. So to tell our students, hey, you can't draw in your home languages, is to tell them that they can't use that really important resource that they've used most of their life to make meaning. So these ideas and these quotes here just highlight the significance of the importance of multilingualism in our classroom spaces. Okay, here's an activity that I do with some of my students, a multilingual poem. And what I always do is I select a poem or a spoken word poem that often represents some of the identities of students in the classroom. So I have a lot of students from Saudi Arabia who identify as Muslims and females who are wearing the hijab. And when I share something like this is not typically what we see in an ESL textbook. We don't see this diversity of representation. So sometimes they come up to me afterwards and say, wow, this is the first time like I see that, someone who looks like me is also being celebrated by the teacher and that you're bringing it in and we're learning from this person. So this is an example of a poem from Nasim Asghari. She's an immigrant to Canada and she speaks English, Farsi, French, and she says here, I picked up English throughout my 19 years of earthly existence, still not qualified for your offers, forever an immigrant. So despite speaking both the two official languages of Canada, English and French, she is still positioned or seen as an immigrant. So what does that mean? Why would she be positioned in that kind of way? Okay, so important to use resources that represent students' identities. So this is the I am from poem, and I've adapted it here and I've made it really quite simple for beginner learners, but you can also make this a bit more demanding, linguistically demanding text, but I've just made it really, really simple. I am from place, from, and then describe the place. I am from food, etc. So I'm going to show you the poem I made. I am from Regina, Isawa Samnida, from the land of the living skies and squawking geese. I am from donuts and kimchi, from sugar and spice. I am from vast fields of wheat, from snow that crunches under your feet. Okay, so here I'm writing my own poem. So I am from Regina, which is my city where I grew up. Essawasamnida. That means that's the place where I am. So I'm using both English here and Korean. So I'm showcasing my ability to write in the script of Korean. I am from donuts and kimchi. Here I'm writing out the word kimchi. You might have eaten this food before, but as you can see that in a simple poem like this, we can get so much information from our students. We get to understand their language backgrounds, their history, food they like, food from their cultures. So this task in and of itself becomes such a like a rich resource to have students learn about one another. I do it in my first day of class and that they can use multiple languages always surprises them. And then they get to perform it if they want. But there's a lot of ways that we can do this task. So I just want to pause briefly for a moment to think about how is it you could adapt this activity for your own classroom. Maybe you're teaching a different age group, or maybe you're teaching a topic. Maybe you're teaching science or math, or maybe you're teaching a language skill like speaking or pronunciation or script writing or something like that. So one simple task can be adapted in multiple directions. Okay, you can teach, this could be used, for example, to teach nouns. So parts of speech, right? You're teaching nouns, teaching adjectives, describing a place, describing a food, describing an animal. You can teach speaking with this. You can teach curricular content, history, geography, languages. You could use this in a social studies classroom. This could be used as a pre-writing brainstorming activity, perhaps for something else, an essay, a story. This could just be for idea generation. You could adapt this to higher levels for to talk about family traditions or to get them to use more complex adjectives and then kind of sensory details. So there's many ways you can take a simple task and adapt it for your given circumstances. Okay, just briefly, some of these principles in designing activities like this is representation matters, participation in that learners know that they can take risks, regardless of their proficiency, that they get to practice and try out activities and tasks. And I think this is part three, flexibility, that learners but also teachers are open to learning new things. And I think it's when the teacher takes a position of a learner in that space that the expertise can really shift in the classroom. As an example, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, what I did was created a different kind of pedagogy to teach English, which is the through the vehicle of spoken word poetry. And when students wrote stories about themselves, they said that, oh, the teacher's not telling me what to do. I'm sharing with the teacher and the class something that I know. And they're talking about no longer being put in a box and having to just learn grammar or learn English or memorize vocabulary words, but they get to actually learn from one another. And this activity of spoken word poetry got students to open up their bias and perceptions of people from other cultures. So, for example, one student wrote a poem about being a refugee, and that had a very a huge impact on the other students in the class, that the other students started to challenge their deficit view of what a refugee is. And they started saying, well, oh, wait, okay, so this happened to you in your life. You had challenges. I also have challenges. And they got to see each other in kind of a humanizing way. So it's very powerful, even though it looks very simple. Okay, so I'm going to end with the same question that I began, which is, should multilingual learners leave their other languages at the door? And instead of asking this question, I think a better question would be, what possibilities become available when multilingual learners draw on all their language resources? Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Shukran. You can use this QR code if you'd like to scan this. It will lead to my Google Scholar site, which will have all my publications there. And you're more than welcome, please, to reach out by email. I love connecting and meeting new people and sharing resources and ideas. So thank you for inviting me into this space. And I look